This is proof that if you hang around long enough, amazing things happen. So Kellyanne and I first knew each other years ago when you were working for Frank Luntz and I was a young reporter, and here we are. So who knew? But life rolls on in interesting ways. You went through an experience I suspect you hadn't planned on in the last 6 months. And we all lived through a night, Tuesday night, that was, I think it's fair to say, different from the one most of us had expected. So let me...
Not all of us.
Okay. I'll take your word for that. Let me start. I want to look more forward than backward, but let me just start with what did happen on Tuesday night and ask you, what was the message? What was the mandate? What was the voice of voters as you read it, now that the dust is settled from last Tuesday night?
Well, first of all, Jerry, thank you for having me, and Mr. Murdoch and Mr. Thompson, Mr. Baker, all of you at the CEO Council and the Wall Street Journal. I really appreciate the opportunity. So the message on Tuesday night is that there is more of them than us. That I think the cues and clues of the election in 2016 were hiding in plain sight. Everything that Donald Trump said about the populist uprising, about people really just wanting fairness and an opportunity and a voice, ended up being true. And we can talk about it being an anti-elitist election. I think that's fine and that has some merit. But at its very core, people were talking about security. It could be security from terrorism, national security, but it's also healthcare security, economic security. It's capital S social security, but it's also small s social security. Donald Trump was out there going to states like Pennsylvania and New Hampshire talking about opioid use, and in Ohio talking about opioid use. That's a different kind of insecurity that was fairly new to our communities. I think people are also talking about everyday affordability. I've been a vocal and longtime critic of Republican politicians who run around talking about job creation. You didn't build that, and I'm a job creator, I'm an entrepreneur. I think that's wonderful. I've been a job creator for 21 years. I think that's fabulous. However, that's about 7% of the country are job creators or fancy themselves as entrepreneurs. There's another 7% that are the job seekers, the unemployed or so, 7% or so. But the vast majority of households are neither job creators nor job seekers. They are job holders. And Donald Trump gave voice to the job holders, the people, Jerry, in this country who say, gosh, when my grandfather had a job or your grandfather had a job, it was enough to support the whole family. We have 2, 3 jobs in the household, and we're white-knuckled at the end of each month trying to figure out how to pay the rent or the mortgage or the tuition or the school voucher, the student loan payment, the food and the fuel. And I think he gave voice to those folks who are just trying to meet everyday needs and have a fair shake. People were also talking about fairness. I think that Hillary Clinton's campaign was about equality. And and a lot of this country, of course, we cherish equality. It's enshrined in our Constitution and our other laws. But most people are talking about fairness, which is different. Fairness is about equality of opportunity, not equality of outcomes. And when you listen to people closely, what really undergirded their views towards education reform, like school choice or opening up more technical and vocational opportunities for maybe kids who just aren't college material. And that's fine. Actually, that's good. When they're talking about immigration policy, when they're talking about tax reform, when they're talking about letting Syrian refugees in by 550%, as Hillary would, or not, they're really talking about what is fair. And I think Donald Trump put issues on the map that no one was giving voice to, like trade and like illegal immigration. But illegal immigration, he articulated it through an economic lens, so that we were no longer only asking what is fair to the illegal immigrant. All of a sudden we were asking what's fair to the American worker. What's fair to ask employers to do? Is it enough to just enroll in E-Verify and wash your hands clean, or should we be asking them to do more? What's fair to local communities? What's fair to folks who they would do the jobs that others are doing, but they can't do it for $6 under the table, and nor should they be asked to. So I think he gave voice to issues that were more part of the social and cultural zeitgeist than just the garden variety political set of ideas. The other thing is I read with rapt attention, but no surprise, that Hillary Clinton had tested up to 84 slogans years in advance of the presidential race. I mean, that's just remarkable. And I certainly hope her pollsters got paid by the slogan. But Donald Trump basically started and ended with "Make America Great Again." And some people criticize that, but its very essence, it really was about patriotism, and it was about aspiration and opportunity and freedom and frankly, fairness. And the other thing I would just take from all of this, Jerry, you said, what's the message? A couple of messages. One is that ethics and veracity are a qualification for President of the United States. I think that folks in Hillary Clinton's campaign, which is filled with brilliant, savvy strategists, including her, the candidate herself, but the idea that temperament or what you said 20 years ago is an affirmative criterion and veracity and trustworthy or not is just not going to be true. You're not going to convince voters otherwise.
But I think it's also fair to say that he tapped into an anger that was out in the country, and it produced, I think, a somewhat divisive campaign, an angry campaign. In some ways, I think it was reflected in the first question we heard tonight. So I guess one of the things I wanted to ask you was, what can be done now to heal those divisions? I mean, what would you say to a Hispanic family that is worried about the tone, or a Muslim family that's worried about the tone? What's the message to them, and what can and will Donald Trump say to those people in the weeks ahead to sort of tamp down the kind of concerns that we're seeing?
Let me just say, too, you went back to 1994 when you met me when I was working with Frank Luntz on the Contract with America, and the word anger was also used in 1994 to describe. Remember, Frank Luntz actually had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal right before Election Day 1994, and he said in it, to say the electorate is angry is like saying the ocean is wet. I remember it verbatim. I think that has merit, but I also think angry as a way to describe the electorate is a little bit of an excuse, and it was an excuse to not actually listen to voters. And I think many people who their day jobs are to listen to voters, to really get to know what America was trying to tell us. I think they fell down on the job because they said, well, they're angry, so I can just be a wrist flicker. They're angry, they're scary. They're peddling hate and divisiveness when really many of them were just frustrated and fearful, legitimately fearful and legitimately frustrated that they can't pay the bills, that they just can't get ahead. There's nothing else they can do. They have a job. They live a good life. They pay their taxes. They pay their dues. They play by the rules. And yet they always feel like they're in the quicksand of everyday affordability. And so I want to say there's frustration and fear and not just anger. To answer your question, I would harken back to what President-elect Trump said when he was elected. I guess by then it was Wednesday morning, not Tuesday night. And he said, and he wrote this speech, I was there, and he said, I will be the president of all Americans, even those who did not support me. And that's quite a many million. And he means it. Rudy and I can tell you he means it. So let's begin there, that he will be president to all Americans. You're asking specifically about the Hispanic family, the Muslim family, anybody who I hope that they have heard him say he's expressed regret for any pain he's caused, particularly if it was done with words, and he did not intend to do that, and he means that as well. He said that in August at a speech in North Carolina. I would beseech them to at least listen and at least acknowledge that he is their president. And that's the same message I would have to the protesters. They have a right to air their grievances, but I also just think they were caught flat-footed and unaware. People got an election result they were not anticipating. And so all the talk about who is angry and who won't accept the election results and who's not appreciating the natural organs and processes of democracy, we're asking the right questions, but about the wrong candidate and about the wrong candidate's supporters. So give him a chance and see what he does as your president. I know he loves this country. I know he made enormous sacrifices to run for president, A lot of politicians run for power and prestige and status and money and fame. He had all of that. And he and his family, who I've gotten to know very well and respect enormously, have made very big sacrifices to do this. And it's for love of the country and the belief that they can actually make a difference.
So if you are looking at trying now to move into Washington and govern in a city where I would argue that both parties are divided. You've got Republicans. There's a populist strain, and Jerry and Mayor Giuliani were talking about this earlier. There's a populist strain, and there's a conservative, more traditional conservative strain. The Democrats have traditional Democratic politicians and Bernie Sanders politicians. How do you bring that mess together to create a consensus in Washington? Because it seems very hard to me to be able to move from this campaign, as divisive as it's been in both parties, to a place where you can create policies that bring people together.
Well, first, Sherry, I would note that we may want to look at that as a source of strength and not weakness, meaning you just mentioned the two major political parties, and you talked about the divisions or the differences within them. But it's probably good for the country, and anybody who calls himself or herself a Republican or a Democrat or an independent leaning toward the other party, it's probably a source of strength and comfort for them that their party has different strains within it. So you mentioned the Democratic Party. You said traditional Democratic Party and Bernie Sanders voters. Well, the Bernie Sanders voters ended up being an incredibly potent force. I mean, this was not nothing. He won 22 states against a woman who we've been told for 8 years at least now, maybe 10 or 12, is a shoo-in for the presidency and has now lost it twice. First in the primary to President Obama, and now, of course, to President-elect Trump in the general. And so Bernie Sanders got millions and millions of votes, and I'm not sure, in fact, I'm pretty sure, that his brand of, you can call it socialism, you can call it democratic populism, but his message was never fully appreciated, respected, and assimilated into the larger Hillary Clinton message and campaign, which I think is a mistake. I was happy to see it as Donald Trump's campaign manager, but I think that was a mistake. So I think there's work to do. I'm also not sure this is the Democratic Party anymore that I grew up in, where the Second Amendment is respected, where there are actually pro-life Democrats, where there are Democrats who would dare say, I think we can actually use a flat tax like the one JFK had, in essence. I don't see them. They're not there. I mean, as I sit before you, before Senator Ayotte lost her reelection, the Republican Party had, and one of them is here, the Republican Party had 6 female United States senators, but 3 were pro-life and 3 were pro-choice. You've probably never heard that before, because who would tell you? The Democratic Party has many, many more female senators, but they all have one view on a pretty divisive issue in our country. So the Republican Party, to me, seems like the one that's going through, I would call welcome growing pains, one that's actually expanding its constituencies, expanding its ideological reach, and we just found out expanding the electoral map by going back into these so-called blue states that haven't gone Republican in decades. Literally, we have about a third of the population that's been born, maybe more at this point, since Wisconsin went red. Neither of the Bushes, who were president, ever won Wisconsin. Hasn't been won since 1984, and Donald Trump won it. So that's a sign of a growing party, not a shrinking party. And I'm one who is optimistic about having this large Republican Party where people feel welcome. And it really depends, too, and we tried to do this at the Trump campaign in our modeling. People, we look, I think in politics and media, we look too often at people just through these demographics, your gender, your race, your ethnicity. But people, you have to look at them situationally as well. If you have been negatively affected, if you feel like you have been negatively affected by the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, that's how you're voting this year. And it's almost irrespective of your gender or your ethnicity, or even your socioeconomic status. Situationally, if someone close to you has lost a job, then that's the prism through which you look at this election. And again, it's apart from your gender or your ethnicity by and large.
There are a lot of things to do in a transition, obviously. I wonder if one of the things that President-elect Trump feels a need to do is to somehow reach out to the country in a more kind of formal way to address some of these divisions, to try to bring people together. Have you talked about that? Is there something planned to make that happen in the next 2 months before the inauguration, which is the obvious point at which this traditionally occurs?
It has been discussed, and I think you see early signs of it, even though he's ensconced in the Trump Tower right now, working really hard, receiving calls from heads of state and elected officials from both sides of the aisle and other opinion leaders. Jerry, I think, first of all, he and Mrs. Trump coming here to Washington less than 36 hours after being elected President of the United States, him coming here to meet with President Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama and Vice President Biden and, of course, Senate Majority Leader McConnell and Speaker Ryan, especially his meeting with President Obama and First Lady Obama, I think that was so incredibly important to show the country that the sitting president and the president-elect, who had really battled it out pretty viciously there for a while, and personally, not for a while, I would say up until the last moment.
a long while, you might say, yeah.
Somehow they were able to lay down the muskets, if you will, and just and love their country so much that they want to make sure there's a peaceful transition of power. I think that's the earliest and best and brightest sign that you have about the President-elect Donald Trump wanting to address the entire country as one. The second one is frankly his interview with the Wall Street Journal's Jerry Baker and Monica Langley over the weekend, and the readout I got from that, and then of course what was published. I think his interview on 60 Minutes last night, where he was asked specific policy questions, where he immediately denounced those who say they support him, who are peddling hate and divisiveness, and he just told them, cut it out, just stop it, and he means it. So, yes, I think you will see that. I think you'll hear a lot of personal flourish in his inaugural address that touches upon that. And I think if you listen closely, I know there was a lot of hurt and pain when he won for many people who weren't expecting it. But if you go back and you read what he said in his words that night, he was already moving in that direction. Now, having said that, the man is not going to become a walking Hallmark card, nor should he. Rudy. He's a tough guy, and he's a tough leader. And America decided it wanted a tough leader. It wants someone who speaks specifically about what he is going to do and does not back down, and is pushing back against this culture of political correctness, and is going to put America first, meaning he's going to renegotiate bad trade deals. He's going to bring jobs back from Mexico and China, all the things he's talked about. And he, at that night in his speech, he said, because I remember it verbatim, he said, and to the world community, I will always put America first, but I will work with you and I will be fair. And he's going to aim to do both.
I wrote a column at one point during the campaign, and it said, those people who wanted an independent presidential candidate for years now have one. His name is Donald Trump, because he really did run as an independent. He was, and I guess the good news, if you're in the position of being the president-elect and his team, which you are, is that you're not really beholden to anybody. The bad news is you probably have a less solid core of support in this town than is normal. I guess the question then becomes, does he work with Republicans in Congress? Does he accept the Republican Party policy agenda that Paul Ryan spent a lot of time over the last year constructing in the House? Or do you start over at this point?
Well, this will be his presidency, and this will be his vision. He's been very clear about his 100-day plan. Anybody can pull it up as I sit here, although pull it up later, please. And you can see what he's talking about. It's very specific. Before that, he had talked about, through the help with great economic, brilliant minds like Steve Moore and Larry Kudlow, he talked about his jobs and tax reform plan, creating 25 million jobs over the next 10 years, unleashing energy independence and really just energy sources, shale and coal and natural gas. He also talked about infrastructure investments, quite significantly, educational reform, defeating radical Islamic terrorism, reforming the Veterans Administration. Folks, these weren't sound bites and bumper stickers. They're 10-point, 4-point, 5-point, 7-point plans that the policy wonks among us would enjoy. So you can expect that, Jerry, to define how he goes in there. Now, he's already off to a very good start of working with Speaker Ryan. I've witnessed some of those calls. He had a great meeting here last week, as did Vice President-elect Pence with Speaker Ryan. and they go way back. So I believe that they'll have to find a way to knit together what was already being worked on and could never really be signed into law because they had a Democratic president in President Obama, and what Mr. Trump has put forward as his plan. But look, the excuse of divided government is over. And I think it's causation, not coincidence, that Americans gave a Republican president, a Republican House, and a Republican Senate, a majority of Republican governors, 69 of the 99 state legislative chambers. I've read somewhere if the Democrats now control 26% of the legislative chambers, if they lose one or two more, they're lower than the threshold that you need to defeat a constitutional amendment. I mean, these are not squeakers. These are not close. It might be a divided country. That was not a divided election in those terms. And so he has been very, very specific in what he plans to do. If people didn't hear it, then they didn't want to hear it because it's there.
So if you're looking at that Republican Party you just described, there's a question about whether it is now a populist party or is still a conservative party. And I think for the CEOs in this room, I suppose that generates some mixed feelings. The anti-regulatory message, the tax cut message undoubtedly is cheered, although there's probably some concern about the big is bad, the anti-free trade agreement, the XM Bank is crony capitalism. Those might cause a little more heartburn. What would you say to the people in this room as they try to figure out what does this version, the new version, the Trump version of the Republican Party stand for on the issues that concern them?
So Donald Trump has been very clear about his views on all of that. He'd like to withdraw our participation in the TPP. He wants his plan to create 25 million jobs over 10 years is centered in part in debt reduction, centered in part in energy and infrastructure investment, but also, Jerry, it's centered in part in a growth, economic growth over 3%, not the anemic growth we have now. And people say, oh, again, the wrist flickers. They know everything. The wrist flickers, like, you'll never get growth. Well, let's at least try. I mean, does anybody think the growth rates we have are the best we can do? He doesn't. Vice President-elect Pence doesn't. So he's got, the whole plan is there. The other thing is that he doesn't say all trade deals are bad. He's made very clear he believes NAFTA was a bad deal for the American worker. It sounds like a critical mass of private union households and certainly non-college educated households in places like Wisconsin and Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, really all the people I grew up with, they agreed. I mean, he won them by 2-1. It was a remarkable rout among that group. And in large part because he says, I'm going to renegotiate bad trade deals. He doesn't say he won't have trade deals. He just is pointing out that some of them have not worked for the people they were intended to benefit. He wants to, in his 100-day plan, he wants China to be declared a currency manipulator. Having said that, he spoke with the leader of China today. So
How'd that go?
It was fine. I think there's a readout that's been made public, I understand. That's all I'll say about that and a lot of other things. But in any event, he's made very clear that Washington has wanted for 30 years at least. I mean, I've been in polling for 28, so at least 28 years. They've wanted an outsider, somebody who owes nothing to anybody in Washington, to come here and just clean out the rot from the inside out. And it's important that they finally got that chance, because it was an open question whether the 72% of Americans who tell the Wall Street Journal pollsters and others, I want to take the country in a new and different direction, I want change. It's an open question whether they were actually going to vote for it, vote for somebody who's never done this before. Right. And they did. And good for them for actually saying, I'm going to follow that through.
So, public opinion, as you say, is your business. Did the Trump movement and the Bernie Sanders movement proceed from the same headwater?
Yes, in large part it did. And they also had something else in common, along with the Barack Obama movement of 2008, which is Hillary never saw them coming. And that's a problem. And I'm not picking on the loser here. I'm just saying that if you misread America, you really can't govern America. And the idea that they didn't see Senator Obama coming in 2008, I know steps away from here in Georgetown and a now legendary dinner party, a woman at the dinner party remarked to a big Clinton advisor, what about this Senator Barack Obama running? I mean, I really enjoyed him at the 2004 convention. I thought he was terrific, and they just said flash in a pan, flash in a pan. Two-term presidential flash in a pan, by the way. So they never saw Barack Obama coming. I think they never saw Bernie Sanders coming. I believe Hillary Clinton would have been a much stronger Democratic nominee had they not cleared the field for her. Because had there been 4 or 5, she would have risen. I thought her best debate was the first debate, but there were 4 or 5. And then they never saw our comeback coming.
Would you have been in worse shape if you'd had to run against Joe Biden, the guy from Scranton?
I mean, maybe, but he didn't run. You can only run. Look, it's like the lottery. You can't win if you don't play.
You get to speculate.
No, I actually think not. And Joe, Vice President Biden, can you tell he's been around a long time? I grew up in the Delaware Valley, where he is legendary. But look, maybe, maybe not. I think that the cultural zeitgeist that Donald Trump was able to capture was a rebuke to really everybody who's in a position of power and represents some type of lobbyist, consultant, politician, opinion elite, media access, AXIS is what I mean by that. And Vice President Biden would have been left. He could have done nothing but own the Obama-Biden presidency. I would think that would be weird if he hadn't. Joe Biden not owning the Obama Biden. And that would have been a difficult thing to do because a majority of Americans still have major questions and reservations about the Affordable Care Act. They just do. It hasn't worked for a lot of folks. And many folks who said that sounds like a good idea for the people who need it didn't realize their premiums would be increased or their quality and choices would be diminished or that they had been lied to, Jerry, 24 times, that if they like their plan, they can keep their plan. If they like their doctor, they can keep their doctor.
Right, but the president's job approval rating is at 54, 55% now, so maybe that would have been a little
I think they were comparing him to, the nominee. And he was, and I would expect that for him. I think he is popular. But that popularity was not transferable to Hillary Clinton.
Yeah. One last question I want to turn to the audience. And Steve Moore, one of the brilliant economic thinkers, is out there. I want to ask him to kick it off. But let me ask you one final thing. So when you campaign pledging to drain the swamp and then you arrive at the swamp, how can you work with the swamp? And I don't mean you, of course, but I mean...
Well, that's all right. You can. So for years, I've had this phrase, staph infection, and it's my way of describing the consultancy, particularly the Republican consultancy. I just feel like candidates often lose and consultants always win. And when I say consultants, it's also the lobbyists and the opinion elites. It's like, they made this excuse, like, Bob Dole, he just seemed too old, and Mitt Romney, he seemed too stiff, and John McCain, people thought he was, couldn't do it. And it's like, guys, the other thing all 3 of them had in common was you, and please don't come back a 4th time. And this time they did not. They got purged from the system early. And I think that the public, the voters, particularly in the primary electorate, the Republican primary electorate, Jerry, were rebelling against, again, the them, not the us. There's a lot more of us, if you will, than them. And I can't tell you how much credibility and legitimacy Donald J. Trump has to come and say he's going to drain the swamp. A, he's not part of the swamp, but B, no one got rich off of his campaign. Trust me. No one got rich off of his campaign, which I think is very fitting for who he is. The article's out today that he won, having spent probably even less than half than Hillary Clinton spent. And if you are surrounding yourself with a small core team, I think Brooklyn had 7 or 8 times our staff, a lot more, double plus our money. You have credibility to say, I'm going to come here now and not need all these extra people to tell us what's going on. Now, his Drain the Swamp plan, it's also online. You can look at that. And it does talk about term limits. It does talk about lobbying bans, and which probably will weigh on some people's minds before they go into the administration. But, people in this country are very wise. My job for years has been, how's it playing in Peoria? I get on the airplane and I go see how it's playing in Peoria as a pollster and a focus group moderator. And for years, people have said, do we really need 5 people to do one job? I would think, without even knowing what that job is, the answer is no. And the American people are way ahead, I think, of the political class here in saying, the waste, the abuse, the duplicativeness, the non-responsiveness, the labyrinth, Byzantine, molasses-like pace of the government. That could be turned around. But I think the swamp, you can drain the swamp and still have an effective government that works.
I want to take questions, but I did want to start with Steve. Steve Moore was one of the 2 co-authors of the Obama tax cut plan. Steve,
Definitely not the Obama tax cut plan.
Is that what I said?
That's an oxymoron.
Oh, sorry.
The author of the Trump tax cut plan.
It's the other guy. The Trump tax cut plan.
The president-elect.
President-elect. Steve, if you don't mind standing up just for a minute and describing in general terms what it is you guys have done, how it's going to work, and where do you think it goes from here? I think there's a microphone right behind you.
Right behind.
Thank you, Jerry. Kellyanne, congratulations. Mayor, boy, did you knock it out of the park. By the way, Kellyanne, I was in Florida this weekend, and I saw a bumper sticker that I think explains why you defied the polls and won. It said, vote for Donald Trump. Nobody has to know. Fantastic. Right? I mean, that's everything. Right?
By the way, I talked about that. I want to say I talked about the undercover Trump voter 4 months ago, and was criticized by the Wall Street Journal. But we're here. We're good. We're here.
So yeah, I did work on the tax plan. And quick story, by the way, Mayor, it emphasizes a point that you made. When Larry Kudlow and I first met with Donald Trump about 4 or 5 months ago, we met with him in Trump Tower, and he asked Larry Kudlow, you all know Larry Kudlow of CNBC, and he asked the 2 of us to be economic advisors to him and work with him on tax plan and other economic issues. And we both looked at each other and we said, Donald, we can't work for you. We believe in free trade. And this is exactly the point you were making, Mayor. He said to us, okay, we can agree to disagree on that, but I want you to work with us on taxes and so on. And so on the tax plan, which we did work on, you summarized it very well, Mayor. This is the heart of the plan is a business tax cut, and I actually think, Kellyanne, we can get this done in the first 150 days. Mm-hmm. I really do. I think we can do it with Democratic votes. And Senator, we were talking about this, that I think we can get a lot of Democrats to vote for a business tax plan that actually has some infrastructure spending in it. And basically, we want to take the highest business tax rate in the world. By the way, not just for corporations, but for small businesses. And I have to tell you all, when we first met with Donald Trump on this, he said, when you do this tax plan, I don't just want it to be for the corporations. He said, I want it to be for the 26.5 million small businesses in this country. And I said, wow, okay, we will do that. So that 15% tax rate that we're talking about is not just for Boeing and Microsoft and Apple, but every single small business in America, including the small business startup in Silicon Valley and the Korean grocery down the street in New York City, will get that tax cut. And I believe we can do this. And by the way, you're exactly right. Another big part of this is that 10% repatriation. So money that is stored overseas, and we believe there's about $2 trillion. We got that number from the Wall Street Journal, so it must be true. We believe we can bring a lot of that back in and raise about $100 billion. And this is me speaking for myself, not necessarily Mr. Trump, but I think we could use that money for an infrastructure bill and put it in a big package, Senator. And we have a jobs bill that is a corporate business tax cut with infrastructure spending that could be one of the biggest jobs bills in history. And I'd love to see it with 15, 20 Democrats in the Senate. And, Ronald Reagan, you mentioned Ronald Reagan. When you remember, Mayor, when he passed his tax cut, the first bill he passed with many, remember we used to call them the boll weevil Democrats. The other one in 1986, just for a frame of reference to those who think this can't be done in a bipartisan way, when Ronald Reagan proposed to cut the highest income tax rate to 28%, that bill passed the United States Senate 97-3. 97-3. So I hope we can do it in a bipartisan way, Kellyanne, and just congratulations to the 2 of you. You did such amazing work. And the only other quick thing I'll say is that energy component you're talking about, Kellyanne, is so critical. I mean, we can be the leading, we can be the energy superpower of the next century. We have more oil and gas and coal than any other country in the world, and we should use it. And I think this was a big distinction between where the Democrats were and where Republicans were. The Democrats' philosophy has been keep it on the ground. And I hope I really hope, Kellyanne, that Donald Trump will put those coal miners back in their jobs, because that's what they want. Okay, I'll stop there.
Questions? One right there.
Right here.
Thank you. Ms. Conway, congratulations to you and the Trump team. My name's Corey Bernardi. I'm an Australian senator from the Liberal Party. I don't want that to alarm you. The Liberals are the Conservatives
I know.
down under. But having been an observer of this election for the last 2 months, as I've been based in New York City, I've been acutely aware of the hyper-partisanship of sections of the media, both the broadcast and the print media. The one noticeable exception, I think, has been the Wall Street Journal, and all credit to them. They have sought to present both campaign ideas and ideologies. But how do you see the media as playing a role in your campaign strategy? And ultimately, in your assessment, did the pile-on in favour of your opponent work for you or against you?
Thanks for asking that complex question. The question is about the media and the role they played for us. So I happen to be very pro-press, obviously pro-First Amendment. I like the idea that the Trump campaign, after I came on board, restored all the press credentials that had been suspended. But I'll say at the same time that the media culpas, as they're calling it now, of how they got it so wrong, it's not just a matter of the wrong methodology polling-wise. It literally is the inability to listen to Americans. And if you look at people's byline, if you look at when they're filing the story, it'll say Muscatine, Iowa. It will say Columbus, Ohio. It's like, well, who did you talk to? Because all around this country, including, if not especially at Trump rallies, 20,000 strong at a clip, there were people there, and they would have told you why they were there. But what did you learn about Trump rallies? You learned that there is some idiot with some T-shirt, or someone saying a stupid, pathetic, something to a camera that doesn't reflect Donald Trump or his campaign or his vision for America. You didn't learn why they were there. We learned why they were there. And I'm telling you, people should have listened. Instead of listening to each other on a TV set, they should have been listening to Americans. They would have learned a great deal. That's number one. Number two, you are right. Your instinct that the complete pile-on helped us in the end is absolutely correct. We can measure it. So that's different than media bias. That's sort of this telling America what's important to them. And I have said publicly on TV many times, somebody would ask me a question for the 18th time, and I would very politely say, all right, let's try this again. I looked at your polling at CNN or the Wall Street Journal or NBC, wherever I was, and I don't see what you're asking me anywhere in your polling of what America told your pollsters was important to them. But somehow you've all decided it's important to them. I don't see it anywhere. I see terrorism, economy, jobs, healthcare, immigration, corruption, education. But there's sort of almost this lemming-like rush to say, this is what's important, and we're going to cover it for the next 5 days on a running cable loop. Now, if you're saying the same thing for 5 days, you should take down the breaking news song and Chiron, okay, just by definition.
But to be fair, that benefited your candidate enormously through the primary season. He was the running loop for 3, 4, 5 months.
And I think because the idea was, let's give him a lot of press coverage and wait till he destroys himself.
Well, maybe, but he was but let's face it, he was the beneficiary of that.
And then it's like, oh boy.
No.
I think Jim Rutenberg from the New York Times put it best, and others have written similarly, but it was August or September. Rutenberg at the New York Times wrote a front page piece, and he said, look, this man forces me to suspend objective journalistic standards. I just have to stop the madman. I can't be a journalist. And there were many people following suit. And it's unfortunate because the media are filled with very smart people who spent a lot of time on the road covering this campaign, living out of suitcases. And so but the other thing I want to tell you is I think it created sympathy for Donald Trump in the end, because you had a couple October surprises, believe me, on both campaigns. But I did not understand I did not understand why the Clinton campaign stuck with the strategy they did, where they basically made the campaign in the end about what Donald Trump said about one or two or different people. And they ran paid ads about it. It went on for 6 or 7 weeks. And you know what happens in America? We move on like that. And you're like, seriously? This is the 500th time you've been in my living room telling me this is important to me, and it wasn't important to them. If it was important to them, they had already assimilated it into their voting score, if you will. But it's missing what is important to people. I also didn't understand why. I mean, in the end, you will, maybe you don't accept it tonight, but think about it. Think about it in the shower and to get back to me. I'm telling you, think about it. And tell me who ran the more aspirational, uplifting, positive campaign toward the end. Our closing messages were very uplifting and aspirational and positive. And Rudy and I were there. I mean, a week ago tonight, we were in Manchester, New Hampshire, and then we went backwards. We went to Grand Rapids, Michigan. And when I found myself eating Cheetos and Oreos at 2:30 in the morning, I was saying, this guy better win tomorrow. This is crazy. And we got home at 4 a.m. But what was his closing message? It was about the forgotten man and forgotten woman and freedom and opportunity and job creation. And Secretary Clinton's closing message was about the fact that Donald Trump takes the wings off of butterflies. And nobody wanted to hear that anymore. This country wants you to talk about what you're going to do for them. And there are people out there who are suffering. And there are people out there who are not suffering, but think that they can't get a fair shake. But any way you cut it, people wanted a substantive, aspirational, uplifting message at the end. And so, yes, I think there's a lot of second guessing, perhaps, maybe in the media in some places. But I would just say, as somebody, a close advisor to Donald Trump, to President-elect Trump, that we certainly welcome, a different approach while he's president. We certainly welcome people to keep a more open mind. But I already saw, as of yesterday, when we announced our first 2 senior staffers, I mean, what were the stories? It was all negative again, back to the same well of negativity. So I think, in fairness to the American people, the coverage ought to at least try to uncover some facts and not have conclusions in search of evidence. Find the evidence and then make the conclusion.
I think we have time for one last question. Is there one over here somewhere?
Well, while they're finding the question, I would add to that the polling also, because the media does its own polling now constantly, like most of my polls will never see the light of day. They're done for private clients. I've been doing it for decades. Most of them are never public because that's not why you hired me, to shout them from the rooftops. I'm the secret keeper, and I'm telling somebody who's in a crisis, or I'm telling somebody who's running for president, or trying to sell a product, or trying to negotiate. I'm telling them what the data says, but not the world. And I think if 98% of your newsroom feels a certain way, your poll is going to end up reflecting that. And what you take from the poll and what you tell America you learned from the poll is going to start reflecting that invariably, because the questions you ask and what you decide to share with people. And I'll give you a great example. I told Mr. Trump, these polls, a horse race is one thing, but these polls are now asking about temperament and are asking about experience as qualification. Polls in 2008 avoided questions about experience as a qualification because Senator Obama was running. Now, all of a sudden, it was the gold standard of polling, temperament and experience as qualification. And so there's even subtleties like that, I think, in the news, that if you want to put that in your poll, as opposed to how about a businessman with owing nobody in anything. I didn't see any of those questions. We certainly asked them, but I didn't see any of those questions. So there's a selectivity that way as well.
One last question right back there.
Much has been made about the data machine that drove this campaign and the influence of social media. As you think about the result and how you guys got there, how much does that play into modern marketing? How does that play into the ultimate result?
It completely. And we had, despite the public criticism that we had no campaign, we have no digital, we have no ground game, we had excellent all of the above. It was a combination of the Trump campaign and the Republican National Committee, in that the RNC had been developing over the last 3.5 years or so really sound models, great ground game investments, field operations, And they came bearing gifts for the Republican presidential nominee. It just so happened it was Donald Trump. So we were able to merge the two to great effect. Our use of digital went everything from running ads to raising money. Obviously, this won't surprise anyone, to touching the voter. I think you have to find many different ways to touch the voter based on literally where they live and who they are and how they like to be marketed to. We modeled some of it off of the Obama 2008 campaign, where he mastered the ability, his campaign mastered the ability to use social media and digital techniques, technology really, to reach voters and certainly to raise money, but really just to touch the voter. And it worked. Obviously, the Clinton campaign had a vaunted data and digital operation, but I also think that candidates matter. I think the candidates matter. Folks have to, I talked often publicly about the 46, that Hillary Clinton had a 47% problem of her own. It was different than Mitt Romney's 47%, but her 47% problem is that she could never really get beyond it in any of the states that President Obama had carried twice with well over 50% of the vote. And so knowing that, we did a combination of digital media, traditional ad buys, digital targeting, modeling of the voters. And I just think that the main use of our digital and data operations within the Trump campaign really goes to how we looked at the electorate. We didn't presume the electorate was who we wanted it to be, and we didn't presume it was the electorate from 2012 or 2008. We saw it shaping up, the messages shaping up a little bit more like 2010 and 2014, but we knew that this would be a presidential year. But we modeled the electorate knowing that Secretary Clinton was going to have a more difficult time pulling together and keeping the Obama coalition than President Obama would. It's his coalition. And we also knew that Trump was a different kind of messenger with a different message than, say, Governor Romney or Senator McCain. Not better or worse, just different. And we put that elasticity into our digital and data modeling, which is another way that we use it, which is the way corporate America uses it. Look, I'll end on this. Most of my business has always been non-political, believe it or not. I like people who pay their bills, and I like to know what more than the electorate is thinking. I mean, everybody eats and sleeps, but not everybody votes or likes politics. And this is what I always try to say, and this is really a very important aspect of data and digital when it comes to politics and electioneering, which is that if Crest toothpaste hired me tomorrow and said, hey, we want more people to use Crest by next year, I'd say, okay, I can do that. But Crest doesn't want me to tell them 1,246,892 more people will use Crest. They just want to know within the margins what their sales projections will be and how and why. And so what would I set off to do? I would set off to do what I've done for corporate America in the past, which is I would figure out, in this case, why the users of Colgate and Ultra Bright and Tom's Natural, why Aquafresh, why they use those brands and not Crest. And I would find all the people who used to use Crest and no longer do, the lapsed Crest users. And I would find the current Crest users. And I would do all this qualitative and quantitative research. You can't do that with politics for a very simple reason. Everybody uses toothpaste, but not everybody uses politics. And in politics, the way you find new consumers is not just by going in and grabbing the other sides, the Clinton, the Obama voters or the Bernie Sanders voters. That's great if you could do it. But you have to find new users who don't think that they need politics at all. It's not a product or service that they fancy, that they're going to seek out and pay for and want to be a repeat customer for. And so in that regard, that is a place where the Donald Trump phenomenon allowed us to find new customers. And we constantly, I haven't been this excited since Ronald Reagan, or I haven't voted in years, or I'm a registered Democrat. And we saw that and we respected that. And that's really what I mean by the undercover Trump voter. It wasn't that they were all shy. It's that they didn't look on paper like Trump voters because they had either not voted in a long time, had never voted, or had voted democratically.
Kellyanne, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.